and I remember so vividly the first time I read this, the distinction between law and gospel is a particularly glorious light. We've managed to cloud it, I think, quite a bit. The distinction between law and gospel is a particularly glorious light. You need all these words to have meaning in your ears. Distinction, what's that mean? Difference, space between, not like another. So there is something about this law and this gospel, whatever that might be, that they are not like each other. And that, knowing that this set of things over there that apparently we think are like each other, knowing that they're not like each other it's not just a glorious light, which I would say that's pretty powerful. I mean, that's what knocked Saul off the horse, made him blind. That's what Jesus did on Mount of Transfiguration. We figure on the last day, there's going to be some particularly glorious light, right? Well, but knowing that you don't know the difference between law and gospel, and then knowing the difference is a particularly glorious light. And, don't put your book on the space bar, it makes noises. So in pondering that, wrestling with it, I've been thinking about it. I'm not going to say that in conversation. So like, hey, how about them Packers? I'm like, well, the distinction between law and gospel is a particularly glorious light. High five. It's not going to happen, right? That won't work. They think pastors are weird to begin with, right? And I want to find a way to speak that you would then say, which means it can't be in the super weird sense. But this truth that learning to see between law and gospel is particularly filled with the glory of God, to the extent that, in the rest of the context here, to the extent that no other thing that's known is quite like this one. Even the bits about the Trinity, the mystery of the Trinity, it doesn't achieve for us what this does. It's a more glorious truth, I would say, but it's not one we needed as much. It's not the heart of the attack against God, which is what the distinction between law and gospel is. But so I've been thinking about how to say that differently, and unfortunately I have it written over there. But I remember that the word distinction just has to go. It just has to go. You cannot talk about the proper distinction with some, second generation Hispanic barber. It might. But what if you just said in the space between law and gospel? In the space between law and gospel is a particularly glorious light. So that's where I'm going. And then, but we got to get that law and gospel thing. And now Lutherans, God help us and forgive us, we have destroyed ourselves with these words. We have parroted law, gospel, so much in order not to call you out and know what you're doing, and thank you. But I mean, this is like the level of Lutheran preaching, the way I see it done in the world. Too much when we talk law gospel. Like or maybe let me say it this way. When you're an Episcopalian from Nebraska, from Vermont, right? And you run into a medieval Midwestern Lutheran, a Missouri Synod Lutheran, and you have a conversation about Jesus, this is about what they see. They're like, oh, okay. They're different. Right? And I think it has something to do with the words themselves as English words. As words that have ceased to be vernacular for what they mean as vernacular in the Greek, right? So when the words you're using now might be the most appropriate translation in all of English for that word, but it's a word nobody uses, and there's another word that is the vernacular word that does the job, you should probably move to that, right? So the proper distinction in the space between now law and gospel. So law, I think law has an easier understanding for the American than gospel does, but I still think it needs to shift. And so for my own mind here, as I'm working on saying this, where I'm leaning on is another way that Confessions, that's this book of Concord, another way that it speaks earlier in the book, Philip Melanchthon in the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, and I believe in the Augsburg Confession as well, was fond of talking about the commands. He did not use the word law. It just wasn't the only word he ever used. And he would talk about the commands, or maybe the commandments, but the commands of God, the things God says to do. And then along with the commands of God, he would not talk about the gospel always so much as the promises. The promises of what God's going to do, or has done and is impactful, has a continued enduring effect. In the space between the commands and promises of God. Now, the rest of the sentence is that is a particularly glorious light. And while I love the copula and will advocate for its existence and usage, especially in the words of institution, at this moment, I think you might go ahead and take some poetic license and make the thing sound good by personifying. I mean, I'm not sure German would ever do this, but personifying the proper distinction between law and gospel. You know what I mean by personifying? Make it poetic. It's not is, it is shining. If it's a glorious light, it doesn't is, it shines. In the space between law and gospel shines a particularly glorious light. How's that sound? That sounds all right. And you're not going to say that high five, right? It's not going to be like that. It's going to be when somebody, and this is where I want to say it, right? I want this in my mind for this moment. When somebody is wrestling in their conscience, when they're struggling with their sin, when they feel guilty, when they're confessing their vulnerability or their shame, whenever they're weak in front of me, I want to be able, if they're ready for it, to cast the spell. So they say to me, I just don't know what to do. I give my heart and I try and I cannot be the Christian I would be. I want to say, in the space between the commands and the promises shines a particularly glorious light.